Yes, yes, you may proceed.
A very good evening to one and all present here. I hope you all are safe and healthy. This is Atin Handuja, founder and CEO of Legal Foxes. I welcome you all to the Legal Foxes online session on the topic From Crime to Court, and we have experts on this topic, Mr. Lalit Ajmani, advocate at Delhi High Court, and Advocate Sarthak Bhatia, associate at Mr. Arjun Vinod Bobde at Supreme Court of India. So without wasting any time, we'll proceed with the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Atin. Hi, good evening, all. First of all, thank you so much for taking out time and giving us the opportunity to share our experience on this matter. As you already have the subtopics related to this session, I'll just give you an overview as to what we are going to discuss in this matter in this session, and then we will proceed further. So first half till the stage of, I would say, framing of charges. This is the thing that I am going to discuss. So in this first session, what we are going to discuss is actually how a crime travels to the vicinity of court, and what a person should do, and what are the basic mistakes which we often do. And the prime focus of this first subsession would be the practical aspects, as well as those practical things read with the law, so that a basic as well as practical understanding could be shared. Moreover, I have specifically included one point, that is the extraordinary remedies, that is defamation and quashing of FIR. We'll be discussing at the time of bail, and prior to the submission of charge sheet, and thereafter, after framing of charges, the actual court proceedings, what happens in court, how people cross examine, and thereafter statement of accused, final arguments, and of course appeal and revision. Those will be dealt by with Mr. Sarthak Bhatia. So now I would like to begin with the first thing, but prior to beginning, I request you all, if you have any questions, you may keep sending it to the chat box. And I request Mr. Ratan, if there is any important thing with respect to any topic, for example, if I am discussing subtopic of bail, and if some interesting, or I would say most relevant issue regarding bail is being asked by any other party, so I request you, you may interrupt and ask that question, so that everything regarding that subtopic would be clear. And of course, at the end, we'll be having a good 15-20 minutes to discuss Q&A session. So I leave it to the sweet will of Mr. Ratan. If he thinks that there is something which we could add during the session itself, I think it would be more, it would be better rather than just having a lecture and then, of course, a Q&A session. So
Sure,
now to
sure.
begin, yeah. So now to begin with, the first subtopic is the genesis of a criminal trial. Basically, it means that the first act, what is crime, and what is not crime, that we need to consider. For example, the commission of crime on the, there is a malified intention, and there is a wrongful act also. But at times we need to see whether it has more colors of civil wrong, or whether it's a purely criminal intention. And it's also related with the second point, that is the filing of police complaint. Now, when the offense is being committed, the aggrieved party is required to inform to the police. He may just call 100 number 100, or he may give the written statement. I'll always suggest to my clients that it's better to write a complaint, because once you write a complaint, it will act as a base of your entire case. So to give an example to elucidate what I meant by genesis of crime, recently I got a call regarding a dispute between a lessee and a lessor. So the tenant was creating some issues because of COVID. He was not able to pay 2 to 3 month rent. So when the landlord started asking for the rent, he started abusing the landlord, stating that you have no humanity left in you, and you are asking about such and such money. And as you can imagine, that during that 30-minute period, a lot of abusive language and other things were exchanged. And later on, this tenant has called up the police and stated that the landlord is creating issues and landlord is actually trying to throw away without the due process of law. So the tenant called me and asked that he wants to file a police complaint. So I said, okay, the concerned person was a law student itself. So I said, okay, I'll draft a police complaint and it's better. And if he thinks that the other party has good connections with police, it's better to file and it's better to get an anticipatory bail also. We'll be discussing about anticipatory bail and bail in the upcoming session. So after a night, I got a draft from the concerned person regarding the bail. Of course, it was a good draft. It was a two-page good draft, but the essence of crime was missing in that complaint. It was looking like that everything is regarding this civil dispute, that one party has asked something from the other and the other party has not given this thing. So if we submit the complaint, or perhaps if we just inform the police in the connotation of a civil wrong, then of course police won't take the action, and then we have to move forward towards the court. So it's important first you need to understand that whether the alleged offense is actually an offense or not. And nowadays, the essence of mens rea is being diluted by the courts. There are so many cases and so many judgments which are stating that this is the time when a person needs to see that the mens rea cannot act as a defense for the accused, because he is it's a prudent knowledge that X offense or such and such offense is itself is self-explanatory, that the mens rea is not required. I think the best example is check bounce cases. In check bounce cases, there is no requirement of mens rea, but again, it comes under the purview of criminal offenses. So again, we need to see that what kind of offense is this, and whether the offense requires mens rea or not, and accordingly we proceed further with the police complaint and registration of FIR. Now, moving forward with the filing of police complaint, as I just told you that it's better to write a police complaint, and it's much better that you submit the police complaint, because in criminal cases we need to see section 468 of CRPC, that is the limitation section. It talks about that the limitation period begins from the date of cause of action, and therefore limitation period will not stop till its conclusion. So a lot of time this limitation period is not being adhered to, and courts are very reluctant, especially in criminal offences, to entertain anything that comes after the limitation period. So for offences which are just of fine, 6 months is the time period. The offences which against which the punishment is given up to 1 year, 1 year is the time limit, and the offences more than 1 year but less than 3 years, less than couple of years, the limitation period is 3 years. So this is the time period which we need to see. And one more thing that we need to consider, that while submitting police complaint to the police will give you a copy along with the receipt. Receipt in the sense that it will give the DD number. In Delhi, it's called DD number. Of course, in other state it might have called GD number. It might have called DB number. So it means that the number of number which is provided against the complaint, because police needs to maintain its police book, its register of daily complaints which the police receive over the particular period of 24 hours. So that's the record, that's the number you have, and that's the most important thing, because sometimes police may go here and there during the commission of the offense, or during the procedure of the trial. So it's viable that you keep the DD number, and only then you may proceed with the case, that such and such police complaint was given and the receipt was also provided to you. So that's important practical aspect that you need to consider, that yes, you will also receive a police complaint along with the DD number. Now the commission of offense is done. You have submitted a complaint to the police. Now, while submitting the complaint, you of course need to mention two things. First, the nature of offense. For example, if the offense is attracting more than 3 or 4 sections, So you need to write not only those 3 or 4 sections, but you also need to write as to how these 3 or 4 sections are coming into picture. Now, to take the example of that lessee and lesser, first there is a offense of insulting the outraging the modesty of a woman can also be attracted because the landlord was a lady. Second, defamation, because her neighbor were also gathered during that exchange fee. So you need to write that here during the process of negotiation, the other party has accused me, and my image was tarnished in front of my neighbors. So that attracts section 499 and 500 of IPC. And thereafter, of course, you will say that if the case requires that the other party has accused you or has threatened you for towards the commission of any providing grievous hurt or any kind of offense. So all these 3 sections need to be mentioned along with the reasons and facts that how these sections are coming into picture. And the last thing what you need to mention is that you request the police officers to register the FIR, because that's important. For example, if you just submit the police complaint, of course the police is required to register an FIR if the case asks to, but it's always better, because most of the times, unless and until you have grave offense, or you probably know somebody or the other to the police sometimes take time to register the FIR, if not to investigate the process. So it's always better that you write two or three things. Now, moving forward with the possibility of registering the FIR and not registering the FIR. Now, suppose the police officials are good enough and you made out the case in a much elucidated manner, and the police are bound to investigate the matter, and after investigation, police arrest the person. That's nothing better than that. And you, of course, ask the police to investigate and register the FIR. Now, the process in this scenario is that now first police will receive the complaint. It will give the DD number along with the photostat copy of your police complaint back to you. Thereafter, police will investigate the matter. If the police think that yes, there is a case, then the police will thoroughly investigate and examine the witnesses, not only the accused, not only the complainant, but the other eyewitnesses also. The police will also make a Panchnama report, or police will also seize various things which were present during that commission of a crime. And thereafter, after completing its investigation under section 173 of CRPC, the police will submit the report in the form of charge sheet to the magistrate, and magistrate may take the case from there on. Now that's a very idealistic state, that police comes forward and register the case and gives away the charge sheet, and police has done its work. But in most of the cases, or I would say in some of the cases, police sometimes do not adhere to the time period, and due to one reason or the other, gets prolonged the matter. So what you could do, you can first report it to the superior officer of that concerned police officer to whom you have submitted your complaint. That's the first step that you must do if your complaint is not registered, or your FIR is not registered with the concerned magistrate. Now, suppose if you are in Delhi and if you have given the complaint to the DCP, and even the DCP and the police officer are not taking any action, then you are left with nothing but to file complaint under section 190, 200 along with section 156, 3 of CRPC. That is, you will state all the offences, you will annex the police complaint, and you will also annex the report that you have submitted to the DCP that all these actions were taken, and till yet no action and no FIR is registered against the accused person. Now, what magistrate will do? Magistrate will prima facie see whether there is actual case or not. If your complaint expounds the case on prima facie basis, for example, there is a commission of an offence, there is a commission of non-bailable or bailable offence, and you have submitted the complaint to the police officer and of course to the DCP, then magistrate will ask the police officer to submit the action report. Now, action taken report, it's ATR. As I said that in criminal cases depends upon jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The nomenclature may be different, but the essence is the same. Now, police will come up, police will submit its ATR, and that's set the stage for the final arguments. Now, during the third or the fourth hearing, you will you will present your arguments along with the ATR submitted by the police, and you will say that why the police should have taken the action and registered the FIR rather than stating this. Now, in my experience, what generally police uh, commits in ATR is that they say that there is first, if there is no case of non-bailable offense. Now, in non-bailable offense, uh, if there is no mentioning of non-bailable offense, so it's very difficult for the police to register an FIR. So police may say that there is no case of non-bailable offense. It's more of civil in nature, and we have inquired. We came on the spot. We talked with every other people, and we think that there is no case and there is no commission of crime, and the settlement took place, and that's why we didn't take action. This is one of the main defenses which police takes. Thereafter, the other submission which the police often comes up is that the concerned person has not come up during the period of limitation, and it's more like the personal vendetta rather than any commission of crime. So in these matters, what you need to take care of that first there is a mentioning of non-bailable offense. First, if there is no non-bailable offense, you still say that even if there is non-bailable offense, the bailable offense is such of grave nature that the police ought to take action against the accused person. Thereafter, you will say that the time limit has been adhered to, and in case due to any reason the time period is not adhered to, you will explain the reasons. Now, if the time period is not adhered to, you must mention in the petition itself that needs to be filed before the magistrate at the first instance why the limitation was not adhered to, because that's also set the stage of making your case in a very viable session, that you are coming up with the clean hands and you are not hiding anything else. So that actually gives that actually helps your case. And of course, the few cases which you may require, that one is Lalita Kumari versus State of UP. That's one of the cases which most of the people use during the cases or during the final submission of 156 cases. And of course, I have also used that, and it actually helps. It basically says that it propounds the guidelines regarding the police as to what needs to be done when the police is confronted with a complaint and a request to register an FIR. And the Supreme Court of India in that particular case has explained that in cases of non-bailable offense, it is the necessity, and in fact it is the obligation of the police officers to at least to conduct an inquiry and to register an FIR within I guess 7 days, if not you know after 7 days. So this is these are the things which the police ought to do when they are confronted with the request to register an FIR. So now, suppose if your FIR is registered by the directions of the magistrate, and the magistrate thinks that yes, there is enough evidence, and yes, police has not done its job. So therefore, police is required to register the FIR, investigate the matter, and register the charge sheet. Now we proceed further to the bail, rather than I'm just skipping charge sheet for a while, because now the bail comes into picture. Now I'm taking the stand from the accused side. Now there are two kinds of bails, as we all know that there is anticipatory bail and there is a normal bail. Now in a normal bail is it can only be asked for when a person is detained or arrested. Now suppose if we take the example of second stage where the police is directed by the judge. Now, in lieu of that, police has arrested the accused person, and in the hope, or probably to avoid the possibility that the accused may play with the evidence, or may influence the landlord, or may influence the complainant if the other case asks. So in such cases, you are required to file an application under Section 437 of CRPC, and you just need to stay a few things. That's the simplest thing about the bail application. You don't need to draft lengthy things. You just need to mention few facts, and you need to focus on two or three things, nothing more and nothing less. First, that there is of course no rule from your end. Second, suppose if they, prima facie there is rule from your end, you will say that that your client agrees to cooperate with the police, and your client agrees that he will not tamper with any of the evidence, and he is not even in a position to influence any witness or the complainant as in this case. Moreover, you also need to state that the accused is not going to flee away from the territorial jurisdiction of the case, because he is already deep rooted in the society. For example, if he is a government employee and he has been working for more than 10-20 years, so it's very unlikely that he will flee away. So in such cases, if there is, of course, if there is a bailable offense, it's the right of the accused person to receive the bail. But if the offense is of non-bailable, then it is upon this discretion of the court. Now, the stages, I would say, the appropriate fora to present your bail application is that, for example, if the case, suppose if the case is directed by the magistrate, and the offense requires offense are of such nature that attracts jurisdiction of the magistrate only. So you submit the bail application to the magistrate, and the magistrate has the competence to either grant the bail or reject the bail. Now, suppose if the offence is of such nature that the bail can only be presented to the session court. So, for example, in murder cases, generally in session court takes the bail applications of in murder cases. Now you can proceed with the bail application, and
If you
once,
allow, can I ask few questions?
yeah, yes, yes,
Yeah. So, Ms. Arka Bhattacharya is asking, if my local
uh-huh.
police station is not acknowledging the FIR, can I
Okay,
send the FIR to the police station via speed post, provided that the office of the superintendent of police is far from my home?
yes, indeed. It is no compulsion that you need to go there and submit the complaint in a in your physical capacity. There is no requirement to present yourself. It's equally good that you submit the complaint either by post or by any other means, and you must have the postal receipt of the same. In such cases, what happens that you might not get any answer, and you might not receive the DD number, as I just spoken earlier. So even in such cases, your case is good enough to be tried before, under section 156 if DCP or if the concerned SHO does not take action. So in one sentence, yes, you can proceed with sending the police. You can proceed with sending the complaint via your yeah, via postal receipt or any other means. So it's perfectly all right.
So, Akshay
Is
is
there any
asking,
question? So or should I resume with the bail?
so as you say, if you want to resume with the bail, you can, or like the question, if you want to answer, it's up to you.
Okay, okay. I haven't seen the questions. Okay. Supplementary charge sheet. I'm coming to the supplementary charge sheet. What is zero FIR? I'll coming to that zero FIR also. Okay, fine. So zero FIR is basically it's basically the FIR registered by the police officials who do not have the jurisdiction to entertain that case. For example, these kind of FIRs are generally being entertained in cases of offences. Now, for example, there is a case of, I would say, uh, sexual assault against any girl, and a girl resides at one place, and the offense committed in some other state, and whereas accused resides at some other state. So it would be very incumbent for the complaint, for the victim, to go to the state where the offense was committed or where the accused resides. So it's very impractical for her to go through that. So what this victim can do? Victim can go to the closest police station and inform about all the atrocities or all the unfortunate series of incidents, and that police officer or that police station will register the FIR. Now this police officer or this FIR will be termed as zero FIR. Reason being that this police station does not have the requisite jurisdiction to entertain this thing. Now, what this police officer will do? This police officer will transfer the case to the the concerned police officer, and thereafter the concerned police officer or police station will deal with the matter, and the requisite number or the requisite FIR will be registered. So that's the meaning of zero FIR. I'm sure you must have heard in various infamous cases that what zero FIR is. So that's one of the things with the zero FIR. Now I think that I can yes, I can resume to the bail offences. So as I said that if the person is arrested or detained, there is only one option that you go with before the police station and you ask for the for the bail under section 437 of CRPC. If the offence attracts the jurisdiction of magistrate has the competence, and if the offence is of such nature that only the you know the session court has the jurisdiction to entertain, then only you can proceed with the application before the session courts. Now there is a catch in this scheme, that what happens that when the charge sheet is submitted. Now, so for example, there is a case of murder, or yes, and the charge sheet is submitted to the magistrate. Now the magistrate will commit the case to the concerned session court. Now, what happens that the first date of hearing commits before the magistrate only, whereas magistrate does not have power to entertain or to go ahead with the case of murder, because only the session courts, section 27, 28, 29, these are the concerned sections which describe about the powers of the concerned magistrate and session courts. Now, interesting thing is that sometimes magistrates, they also entertain the applications for bails and for anticipatory applications, and sometimes they refuse to entertain the application and they dismiss the application. This happened with one of my cases, that it was a case of some sexual assault, whereas the party was not arrested because it was more like matrimonial dispute, but the parties were living separately. So the case was listed before the magistrate. I was firstly surprised at how the case can be listed before the magistrate when the case is of such grave nature. Nonetheless, so I submitted my bail application under the apprehension that the magistrate will not hear it. But magistrate dismisses the application, stating that the magistrate does not have the requisite power. But there are certain case laws which say that the magistrate does have power to entertain the bail applications even in such cases, because they are the first authorities who go ahead and who commit the case to the session court. Nonetheless, interim relief was given to me, that for 5 days I can approach the session court and get the requisite bail. So that happened, and luckily I got the requisite bail order itself. So this is one or two practical issues which keep coming up. Of course, it's not possible to come up with all the peculiarities of these things, but in heinous offences, this is the this one or couple of issues which keep coming up, that where would you go and submit your bail application, and at times magistrates don't take the matter in hand despite having a few judgments in favor of them. Nonetheless, that's one of the practical issues that you may face regarding the bail in serious offences. Now, moving ahead with the anticipatory bail applications. Now, that's given in section 438 of CRPC. It says that when there is a apprehension of arrest, and the concerned person thinks that yes, it's very likelihood that he is going to be arrested on the basis of some false complaint, or on the basis of some activity could be done by the other party, then he has the right to approach the session court or the high court. Now, in anticipatory bail application, magistrate does not have any power to entertain any anticipatory bail application. You just need to go to the session court directly. No role of magistrate in such matters. What you need to prove in this, that yes, there is a strong possibility that your case requires grave consideration, and of course the anticipatory bail must be granted, for the simple reason that once the person is arrested, that I think that 50% job of the other party is already done. And in such cases, of course, you need to say that you have no role, and all the other things which I have mentioned in the bail application. You have deep roots in the society. You won't flee away, and you are required, and you are more than happy to assist the police officials to conduct and to stay within the limits of the investigation, or whatever limits or whatever guidelines this court may deem fit. Now in such cases, what courts generally do, courts generally refrain while allowing the anticipatory bail. They refrain the other person from leaving the concerned state or concerned jurisdiction without the due permission of the court. You may keep hearing during the I would say during the season of elections, because one party may defame the other party. It keeps happening, one offense, or one allegation, or something or the other. And one party, if suppose one party gets imprisoned, and if that party is ready to contest the elections, it's so certain that he may lose the elections, or he will definitely win the elections, if that depends upon the voters. So this is the thing that it keeps happening. Now coming to the first case which we have discussed, that in the scenario that the tenant has asked a police official and stated very wrong things against my client. Now, why I asked for the anticipatory bail, because the client has told me that the concerned person, the concerned tenant has no shame, and he has good relations with the police officials also, and he has stated very bad things, or perhaps he has stated everything under the sun which does not even exist. Now there was strong possibility, because first the tenant is not going to pay. Second, of course, considering the depleting economy, it's actually very difficult for the other person to pay, despite the clear judgment of Delhi High Court recently. And the other person, of course, my client needs money for the same. So, of course, there is a strong possibility that this repercussion will again happen, and the other person has called up the police. So it's much better for him to get the anticipatory bail and file the bail application. Why I am discussing this case twice or thrice? Because this, I'm sure this case is quite relevant in today's time, and I think every third or fourth household is handling such issues, either on the business side or either on the rental side. So, and of course, and it's throwing some light on the issues that we are discussing also. So now we move ahead with the charge sheet and requisite measure and the extraordinary measures. Now, before I move ahead with the charge sheet, again there is a concept that you might have read in the poster itself, that the defamation and quashing of FIR. Now, uh, I would first tell with defamation. Now, defamation begins with the from the date of commission of the crime. Even if there is a case, even if the case is pending before the court, the result of the case has nothing to do with the limitation period prescribed under Section 468 of CRPC. Whereas in civil case, civil defamation, if you want to, initiate action for filing false complaint or filing a frivolous case against your client, then you have to wait uh, for the final outcome of the case to go ahead with the civil defamation. But whereas in criminal defamation, it does not matter whether the case is at nascent stage or whether the case is at the final stage. And if you keep waiting for the final outcome of the case, you will lose the requisite limitation period. So once the offense is committed, you can straight away file a complaint under section 200 of CRPC, read with 199, of course, and stating that these false allegations were made against you, and you have witnessed the witnessed the downfall of your goodwill, and of course the other party had the ill intention. So this one thing you need to consider, that at the during the continuance of these proceedings, if your client agrees and if your client feels that yes, there is a case of defamation, you can lodge the counter suit in the form of defamation. Now that's the first requirement that you could move ahead. Thereafter, there is a second extraordinary remedy. That's actually the remedy. The first is the, I would say, the other option that you could move ahead for your defamation. Whereas the remedy is the quashing of FIR. This is mentioned in section 482 of CRPC. Quashing of FIR means that you can move ahead with the petition stating that the entire case is frivolous, bogus, and there is not even a prima facie case which is maintainable against you. And whatever sections are mentioned in FIR, or perhaps, of course, if charge sheet is there, if charge sheet, then you can go and file an application under 482 asking for the quashing of FIR. Now, if the court agrees and if the court thinks that yes, there is a frivolous case and there is no better case to quash the FIR because the allegations are such of nature that it shows vendetta and nothing else. So, in such cases, court saves the accused person from going through the entire process of criminal litigation, and that's one of the tools. But the concerned court is just High Court. You cannot go before a court of session or magistrate for quashing of FIR. It is only the High Court who has the jurisdiction to entertain such petitions. Now, but High Court are very reluctant in quashing FIRs in such cases because the trial is being committed or the trial is being put into place only to consider what the evidence talk about, or is there any good case or not. So court are very reluctant, especially High Court is very reluctant to quash the FIR. Of course, there would be other, I would say, very isolated cases where High Courts have done so, but in generality, courts do not proceed further. But if your client or if you want to proceed further, what you could smartly place in your quashing of FIR petition, that you mention the concerned sections and you say that these are the requirements. For example, there is a case of theft, and there are 3 or 4 requirements in the cases of theft, and you present in the commission in your FIR and stating that even if I prove everything to be true, these 4 ingredients are not present in this case, and therefore at this threshold the case should be dismissed. So this is, I think, this is the better way to prove your case, and perhaps the chances would be better to state that yes, there is a case of quashing of FIR. Now we are in this subsection we are left with the submission of charge sheet. Thereafter, the framing of charges, and then we proceed with the second part of the session, which will be dealt by Mr. Sarthak Bhatia. Now, in charge sheet. Now, what happens in charge sheet? Basically, as I told you earlier, that the police investigate every possible thing which he may ask so. Police will investigate the accused, police will investigate the complainant, police will investigate the eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses are really important because in offences where it's very probable that the other third witnesses will come and will be witnessing all these offences. And in case police does not mention any eyewitness, then the entire case goes against in favor of accused, because police in that case does not perform his duty. In the similar case, for example, if there is a case where I would say yes, if there is there a case of fighting on the public roads in the broad daylight, for example around 12 to 2 o'clock, and if the police investigates the matter and does not impede any eyewitness, it's very unlikely, because people cherish the fights of others, and there will be there will be a flock of people over there, and if police omits to mention even 2 or 3 eyewitnesses, that's goes against the case of the victim. So this is one of the examples what you need to peruse in the charge sheet. Whereas a few other things are also there. There is a Panchnama report, as I talked about earlier, that at the first instance, court will, police officials will go there, and police officials will see that what happened in that particular scenario, whether there is a weapon or whether there is any related item which needs to be confiscated. Police will prepare a map also as to where the offense was committed, and what's the roadmap, so that it would be better for the court to identify and to actually realize okay, this thing is happening, because certain times eyewitnesses play a crucial role, and it's quite often to see the defense that the map which was produced by the police official actually has no bearing with the practical or the actual dimensions of the alleged incident. So for the accused, we'll be discussing in detail with Mr. Bhatia that from the accused side, it's very easy to strike the police reports and the charge sheet submitted by the submitted by the police, because if you see the loop, if you pull out the loopholes from the charge sheet itself, you have nothing to do. And this is the case that this is the time period which police officials take to submit their charge sheet. Now they submit the charge sheet under section 173, and once the court take cognizance of that, now court generally automatically, or I would say as a routine matter, takes the cognizance of the charge sheet. But at times court sees that there are certain prima facie lacunas. For example, as just given you the example, if there is a case of fight in the day broad light, and there is no eyewitness, the court may ask that investigate the matter and see if there is an eyewitness or no. And if there is no eyewitness, then the police official will write it on the in the charge sheet that why there is no eyewitness, or why the people are not coming up. In such cases, generally, what intelligent police people do, they mention the fact that that the people are reluctant to coming forward, or something or the other. Though police have requisite power under Section 91 to summons the concerned person and ask to come and say, to submit it. Now, there is an important thing that Section 92, if I'm not mistaken, during the investigation process itself, if a person needs to submit something, whereas he is not required to, testify himself, or to come up and gives his presence. So what a person can do, that a person is just required to send the concerned whatever documents or related thing to the police, and he does not required to go and cause, unless otherwise mentioned. So we need to see Section 91 and Section 92 whenever this notice comes up. For example, this happens when there are more than one state are involved, or perhaps 2 or 3 states are involved, and the witnesses or the the evidence which needs to be required, these are from various people, and and court of the police official also see that it's not required for them to come up and submit the same thing which they could have done while staying there only. So sometimes they just ask for the production of documents. So when your client comes up with this commission of production of things, or production of letters, or perhaps to come up and say this thing, so you need to see what exactly is stated in that warrant, and whether your concern, whether the person is required to comply with that or not. So that's another thing also, whether it's the mandatory for the concerned person to cooperate with the police or not. General people, it's not required, but for certain businesses, for certain people who are very skeptical that if they proceed with the police, their society members or perhaps their businesses might go here or there. So these interesting things also turn up during the during the criminal case itself. So lot of things happen before actual court proceedings. So and at times, what I also feel that people generally engage lawyers when the court asks, or when everything happens and the case is with the concerned magistrate. Now, what they lose is that the entire investigation process, and of course, the opportunity to get released right from the day one. Even for the witnesses, it's quite possible that they can escape themselves from going through this entire process of criminal litigation, because the witnesses not only required to produce, or not only required to assist the police officials, but at the same point of time, the defense counsel will come up and ask his presence to cross-examine. So it's very tedious for any witness to first assess the police official, then he may be required in a case to come up and do whatever he wants to say. So of course, in the charge sheet, before I conclude with the charge sheet, there is a table of index. I think that's very self-explanatory. You will have the concerned police complaint. You'll have the FIR. FIR is just of 2 or 3 pages, and then you will have a list of accused, and then you will have a list of witnesses, and thereafter you will have the Panchnama report as I said. Then you will have this map, and whatever and the rest of the documents, and mostly at the end statement of the accused, statement of the witnesses if there are, and of course that's how the basic gist of charge sheet, what charge sheet is all about. I've read one of the questions during the first session, that what is the supplementary charge sheet. So basically what happens that once the court during the investigation or during the course of trial thinks that the course has not come up, the police officer has not completed an investigation, so the court may investigate further. And sometimes it also happens that first the police official submit their charge sheet, and during the commission of the during the course of the case, so the police officer finds something else. So they submit their evidence through this supplementary charge sheet. So this happens when the case involves a lot of investigation and a lot of evidences are there, and generally high profile cases are equipped with this supplementary charge sheet. In normal cases, generally I don't see in normal cases supplementary charge sheet is there. However, what important thing is that for example, if the complainant feels or if the victim feels that the charge sheet is bereft of requisite investigation, or the charge sheet is bereft of the concerned accused person. For example, there is an offense committed by 3 accused persons. But in charge sheet, police have just arrayed two accused persons as accused, whereas the third person is also arrayed, but arrayed as a witness. So in this case, public prosecutor can submit an application and ask for the joinder of that particular witness as an accused person. So these are the intricacies of filing charge sheet and going into the details of charge sheet. And in fact, charge sheet is everything in the criminal offense. Nothing needs to be done outside the charge sheet. Now, once the charge sheet is submitted to the magistrate needs to take cognizance. The magistrate will summons the accused person. Accused person will come up, and if he is already on bail, he will submit the bail. And if he is not on bail, in some cases he will submit the bail bonds and ask for the concerned bail, so that he can come up during the case and fight his case. Now thereafter, the stage of framing of charges. Now it's very interesting, and from there on I'll hand it over to Mr. Sadak so that he can proceed further. And so what happened in framing of charges? Sorry.
So we have few questions for you before moving forward to Mr. Bhatia.
I just give me. Can you just give me 5 minutes so that I can wrap up this framing of charge, and then we can hear it and then we can proceed.
Sure.
So, yeah. So just bear with me for 5 minutes regarding the framing of charges. So what happens that once the court takes cognizance, when the court takes cognizance, it does not mean that he has assumed everything against the accused person. It means that yes, court has actually applied its brain and prima facie thinks, yes, whatever police has done in its charge sheet and submitted in its charge sheet, it does make a probable case against the accused person. Now, at the time of second hearing, the accused counsel will be provided an opportunity to present his case as to why these particular charges, whatever the charges are. For example, there is a charge of hurting somebody, and there is a charge of, for example, stealing. So there, for example, there are just a couple of charges. So, and if there is a case that yes, there is a prima facie evidence against the victim. Yes, he has suffered injuries. There is an MLC report also. The concerned medical witness also stating that yes, he has suffered certain injury. And there are eyewitnesses also who have seen these two persons who have seen these 2-3 people fighting. So in this scenario, the accused counsel may say one or two things, that yes, he has not done something, probably somebody else has come up. But now, as you can imagine, prima facie, it seems that yes, this accused person has actually done something or has actually hit the victim. Now, when the prima facie case is made, the court will frame the charge. But on the other hand, if there is a case where, you know, there is no case of stealing, there is no even mentioning of, the accused person has stolen something from the purse of the victim, whereas there is just one statement from the concerned victim. So it's very probable for the accused person to write at the stage of framing of charge, state that the case may require the trial to consider whether there is a case of grievous injury or not, but the case is actually bereft of everything related to the theft. So the offenses related to the theft must be dropped at that stage only. So this is the important stage, and I would say that at least 50 or 70% of headache could be dissolved at that particular stage only. In fact, a lot of time I've seen that lawyers, what they do, they surrender at the time of framing of charge because enough evidence is already available. But I think that's not a smart move. Reason being that first, once you have an opportunity to present an application for discharge, so you can produce something on written which is not available in criminal offenses. Second, if you present a good case and if you present what probably court may hear after 1 or couple of years, and if you actually shows yes there is just a vendetta case, or you just prove something or the other for your client side, then you can actually you can actually put your case in at least one box of the judge's mind, because to be very honest, at the end judges often play with the emotions or often play with the justice. So it's the time where you can put your threshold at the beginning. So and there you can put in the actual frame that every person is innocent until proven guilty. So this is the opportunity you must not lose. And to conclude this thing, there is one other peculiarity about framing of charges. Now, when there are warrant cases, either triable by some sessions court or magistrate court, the sessions court as well as magistrate have the power to discharge the accused person. But if the summons cases triable by magistrates, then the magistrate does not have requisite power to discharge the person, despite there being clear evidence that yes, there is no case against the accused person. For example, in a cases of petty offences and check bounce cases, where summons cases are those where punishment is maximum of couple of years. So in such cases, even if there is no case against the person and the case is pending before the magistrate is actually bound to proceed with the entire case. So in such cases, if your client asks so. And one important legal development in this case, though it's already settled by Supreme Court, in various other cases it's already settled. But one case, that is court on its own motion versus state, that is still pending before Delhi High Court. It is now referred by one of the Delhi session judges regarding the powers of magistrate to deal with such questions of discharge. Now the case is still pending, but I don't think so, because first CRPC is bereft of any such powers given to magistrate, and second Supreme Court and various other high courts have already done with this matter. Though there are conflicting judgments, but it would be very interesting to see what this the Honorable Delhi High Court will take its stand on it. Now, I think I've done with my first subtopic. I request Mr. Ratin if there is any question he may ask, or any other person, or we can move ahead with Mr. Sagar, whatever you may deem. Hello.
Hi, sir. Yeah. I think there are a lot of questions for you from the participants.
Okay, let me. Yeah. So,
yeah.
okay.
So shall I start?
So what you can you can put 3-4 questions at this stage. Okay. And what are the important questions, or you could sum up those questions, and then we can move ahead with Mr. Sagar.
Okay. When should bail application be submitted in court in case of murder? Can it be submitted before charge sheet is submitted?
See, as I explained it to you, firstly, that if you get to know that the other person has, or the police has taken started investigating against you, then you straight away go and file for anticipatory bail application. You should not wait for anything, because once the police arrest the person, and it's very difficult to convince the judge to release your client. Reason being that police will say that the investigation is still going on and it's a very heinous case. At least 14-day custody or 21-day or 7-day custody can be provided. So you should not wait for anything, whether to wait for charge sheet or whether to wait for FIR. If the person is arrested, of course you have no other option but to go for bail. And second, if there is a heinous offense, you should not wait. In criminal offenses for bail matters, you must not wait for anything.
Sir, next question is, if in case of
Yes.
rape, if a rape is committed in an isolated area where there is
Yes.
no eyewitness, then how it would work? The police didn't get any eyewitness, then how the case will proceed without eyewitness?
It's quite akin to matrimonial disputes also. In matrimonial disputes also there are certain criminal offenses. For example, 498A. Now, why I took the example, because a lot of times we witness this matrimonial litigation dispute with respect to this question. Now, in certain offenses, eyewitnesses are very improbable. Now, what if you are from the victim side, what you could do, you could make sure that your medical examination is up to the mark, because sometimes actually police takes you to the government police, government medical officers. So at times the procedure is not being followed up. So you need to first see that. Second, you need to connect the relation between the accused and the victim. For example, if there is if the persons know each other, so both if there is a chat, if there is a telephonic conversation, so you confiscate and you make sure that all those things actually are with the police. And these 2-3 things you must put forward. And what you could do, if you are from the victim side, you could assist the public prosecutor. Will be dealing in detail in the second session. That you could assist the public prosecutor to maintain a chain of events. But whereas if you are from the accused person, it's probably quite easier. You could say that first, if possible, and if there is actual case of alibi, you prove the alibi case. And second, you play, or not to play, I would say, but to go ahead with the principle of beyond reasonable doubt.
Uh,
To prove beyond reasonable, your medical report should be very I would say should be watertight. And often I've seen that medical reports are not good, and often gives one way or the other to the accused person and to hit to the medical report itself. So these are few things which you could consider from both the ends.
so can you please brief up about the interim bail?
Sorry,
Can you
brief
please brief
about
us interim bail?
interim bail. See, interim bail is probably nothing but certain benefits given to the applicant. For example, I have given you the one of the cases which which I've just handled. That Sarthak was also there. Sarthak and me approached the concerned magistrate because the case was listed before magistrate, whereas the offence was of rape only. So magistrate goes against our but gives us the liberty that in 7 days you are not going to be arrested and you can approach the concerned session court and ask for the bail. Now this kind of relief is nothing but the interim bail. So and of course what happens that at times one hearing is not enough for the court to decide whether to grant bail or not. So to keep the matter pending, or probably to give a benefit of doubt to the applicant, court may provide interim bail till the next date of hearing.
So
So
last
this
question
this
to
is
you.
basically
Yeah.
yeah.
Last question to you. A person cannot be punishable for the same crime twice. What are the options available
Yes,
for the victim with whom the same crime committed by the same person after getting bail?
after getting bail. See, we need to understand two things. First, uh, the offense is committed once, and second, the same offense is committed more than once. So the punishment, so the case is not only related with the first case. You may also go ahead and file a complaint regarding the further subsequent events. So those causes of action gives the new dose for the new cases. Now, if you want the same things to, for example, if the case is pending and during the commission of the case or probably during the commission of the investigation, if the accused person after the bail has committed something, first you need to inform the concerned police station in a written manner. In a written, I am explaining again and again because often if you do not provide with the written thing, police may go here and there. So during the commission of the investigation, it's very easy to incorporate those things also. First, second, you if you want to go you want to go against with the bail, you can go and ask for the cancellation of bail. You have the liberty, of course, if the public prosecutor, if the case is already pending, only public prosecutor can go. But if the case is yet to be submitted to the court, then you can go and file for the cancellation of bail. And if lastly, to conclude, if the case is pending before the court and the subsequent the offense is committed, of course, if the witness through the public prosecutors inform the court about it, and you may also take action against this particular case, so that 2 or 3 FIRs can be clubbed together and everything can be dealt with accordingly. So it quite happens that it's not only the case where only one FIR is registered, but multiple FIR are being clubbed and tried together.
Thank you so much, Lalit sir, for this wonderful and knowledgeable session.
My pleasure.
It was indeed a pleasure listening to you. Now I would like to request Mr. Bhatia to continue with the session.
Hello. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Hi everyone. I hope you all are keeping well. So, I think Mr. Lalit has covered almost every topic of criminal trial. And now I may begin. Before I begin with the criminal trial, the commencement of the criminal trial, I would like to draw your attention to 2 or 3 things which have to be kept in mind before the criminal trial begins. The first being, that how could we proceed with the criminal trial. The 3 things that has to be kept in mind while proceeding with the criminal trial is, first, there's a presumption of innocence. We always presume that any person who has come before the court and who has been held the accused by the victim is innocent until proven guilty. The other thing is burden of proof. In the criminal trial, basically always until unless specified, burden of proof always lie on the prosecution. They have to prove that the certain offense that the complainant claims or the complaint for that has been registered has been committed by the accused. And the other part is every offense has to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the most important part in the criminal trial, because the court cannot be left into an ambiguity where, without even knowing whether this has been committed or whether, if the court is in a doubt, the court can pass an order against the accused. So moving on to that, the trials are basically divided on the basis of the grievousness of the offense. There are basically 4 types of trials. They are summary, summon, session trial, and the warrant. So the grievousness is depend upon the offense. Like if the offense is hello, am I audible?
Please continue, sir.
Okay. I just saw a comment that I'm not audible. There's some problem with the voice.
Yes, so you are audible to us.
Okay. So what happens in summary trial, only the small offenses or the petty offenses like theft under 379, they are covered. And the basic importance to divide the trial into these 4 parts is so that the matter can be expedited efficiently and effectively. Because the grievousness only tells how the particular person or how the particular offense is to be treated by the court. Like the summary offense and the warrant are basically tried by the magistrate themselves, and all the grievous offenses where it is life imprisonment or death are tried by the sessions court. Now coming on to that, after this commencement of trial, and after there are basic difference between all the types of trial, and the difference is only about the chronology, but the basic procedure remains the same. And what happens after this is prosecution evidence. So in a trial, this is the most important part. The whole case is lied upon the evidence that is produced by the prosecution, because this is the only point where the prosecution is able to prove his case beyond reasonable doubt. So what getting onto the prosecution evidence, the first part is the examination in chief. Now, before going into that, I'll just give you a brief. Let me tell you about what exactly examination in chief. Whenever any witness is produced by the prosecution, and when he's examined by the prosecution himself, it is the first examination which takes place for the witness. That is called examination in chief. If in simple words I tell you. Also, the important part, in many of the cases, or many of the time, even in my case, I have seen that one does not take examination in chief seriously. What happens is there's a basic practice that everyone does is they just prepare their evidence affidavit according to the statement given by the witness, and just submit that without even without going into the depth of the facts that this examination in chief would play a major role in their trial. Now, to take out that facts from the witness is basically examination in chief. And the important things to note that is that more often the cases, if a proper examination in chief is not prepared, more often the cases are lost because of an unskilled examination chief than by a skilled cross-examination. For those who believe that a cross-examination is the only important thing, there is a misconception about that, because this examination chief is also equally important. The other thing that is to be kept in the mind while conducting any chief examination chief is that one must be aware of the facts of the case so as to prepare a probable nature of defense. The facts of the case is the most important part, where if the examiner doesn't know what isn't aware about some of the facts of the case, or he tends to avoid some of the part which plays an important role in his case, then that leads to a very tedious task, because at the later stage he won't be able to prove the same. Also, the examiner must know the particular witness. He must know what all facts to be included, so in which the witness is to be deposed. When the examination in chief, when the examiner basically initiates his initiates an examination, so in that time it's important that he should see what all points are important, that so that this he can be deposed on what all important points, or on what all important facts that the witness can be deposed. The other thing is to prepare the examination, to prepare the witness in such a way so as to displace the foundation of the defense. Whenever any trial begins and the prosecution begins with this case, it's important that prosecution knows about everything that might come in his way. He is aware of all the facts, or all the the defense that would be taken by the accused. So it's important that prosecution initially introduce themselves and dispose of that at the initial stage only, so that the fact of even questioning about that doesn't arise. The other thing is that it's important that examiner must know the witness. Why is it important that he must know the witnesses? Because the witness, there are different types of witnesses. Matlab, example, if I tell you there, in some cases, the witness is, if it is a timid or a frightened one. So in that case, what the examination in chief has to do is, he is to encourage the witness. He has to prepare the witness priorly. He has to not, I may not say that word tutor, he can't be tutor about it. He just have to keep the truth and the facts before the court. But at least he should be given what all questions may be asked, how he has to answer, and he has to go about it. There are others example as well. If someone is very talkative, then he must be apprised of the fact that to check the facts first, to listen first. And same happens with the overconfident ones, who are very overconfident ki, that we will be able to very well perform in it. What they tend to do is they tend to not understand the question and answer without even listening. So it is important this examination in chief prepares a witness properly so as to properly establish a case, or on the later stage would definitely harm the prosecution. And all this has to be done without leading any evidence, at least not without the consent of the court. During this examination in chief, one cannot lead evidence. One cannot lead evidence. One cannot lead evidence in examination in chief. Other thing is that any examination, the examiner must have a great composure in himself. It's important. Why the great composure is important is sometimes the witness turns hostile. In that time, in that case, the examiner had to have that composure so that he doesn't spoil his case because of one small glitch or one small technique, one small error of the witness where he has turned hostile. I'll get on to the hostile witness in the later part. So it's important that the chief examiner must have a must have a great composure. Okay. Now coming on to the cross-examination. What happens is after the chief examination of the person, chief examination is done, the next stage that comes is cross-examination of a witness. Cross-examination is basically done by the counsel who can not only go into the facts which have already been dealt in the examination in chief, but can also go beyond that, sticking to the relevancy of the case. It's very important while preparing, it's very important while preparing a cross-examination, it is important to determine the goal. Why? Because if one doesn't know what exactly one wants to achieve, then he might tend to get into some other direction. It's basically as simple as your football. One needs to know where one wants to hit the ball, because if he doesn't have a goal, he doesn't have a proper direction to go about it, then the other person might take the ball from his post. Now, getting into that, it's important that one must plan his cross-examination. How can the cross-examination be planned? That is a question which even I, in my initial time, faced. How do I go about it? How do I properly plan my cross-examination? Because I don't know what all will be there. How can I? What are the facts that I have to look into it? The important thing is first is to know about the facts of the case. If you know about the facts of the case, you know about what you want to achieve, then accordingly you have to frame your questions like that. If one wants to know that when was this offense committed, then one must have a proper planning about it. Because if you directly ask a question from a witness, he might or might not try to lie about it or not answer you properly. So one has to make a trap so that he gets into it without knowing, and how the traps get set. Basically, what initially during my cross examination I I was told by my seniors or mentors was that to make the witness feel calm and relaxed, that one must start developing a friendly relation. uh, in uh, in most of the cases, what happens is how I start with my cross examination is I just simply ask a question: Ki, what's your name? That tends to mostly irritate the judges, and especially if you are in any other cross examination other than the criminal trial, or be it arbitration or anything, the judges tends to get irritated by these type of questions: Ki, what's your name? Where do you reside? Have you signed this? But it's important that you just feel the you make the witness feel very comfortable about your questions. Ki, what's your name? What's your residence? Have you signed this? Are you aware of the statement made by you in the your examination chief? So in that case, it's important that you make the witness feel comfortable, and only after he feels comfortable, he gets into your zone. And as soon as he gets into your zone, it's the time you rise. And let me tell you about it. It's very easy when you start practicing, when you have the grasp of your facts of the case, when you have prepared your witnesses, you will be very easily able to detect when to rise, because that will be the time when the client or the witness will start giving you hints that he's become comfortable about it, and now it's time for you to set a trap. Also, it's important in cross examination when to stop. During the cross examination, it is very important that one needs to have a clear perception of what he wants to ask, what he wants to hear, and not more than that. You need to ask what you already know about. Never surprise yourself or surprise a witness by asking a question that you even don't know answer to. There might be some thing that your client that the prosecution the client must have not the accused must have not told you, and now asking those questions and bringing those facts before the witness will only harm your case. So it's important that you know when to stop, and it's very famously quoted by some American advocate itself, who says that it's important that you ask what is absolutely necessary, and once the and to stop when once the witness is broke, and if you know and if you don't stop at that time, the witness will break you. So it's important that you know when to stop. The other part is using of leading evidence. So as I told you earlier, in the chief examination in chief, one is not allowed to lead evidences, but in during the cross examination, there is no bar and no any restraint to the cross examiner regarding the leading evidences. Regarding the leading questions, he can very well ask the leading questions so as to uh, make the witness feel more uncomfortable about the situation, so as to give something in his some words in his mouth, so that he isn't able to decide and give the proper and surprise your case or harm your case. It's and While after considering all these points, these are all the points when we must take care of. The next point which I want to tell about the cross examination is how you should attack your ability to perceive. It's important when you go through your facts and when you hear the witness's case, when you hear the accused case, it's important you see what all obstructions are there. Like in one of my case, what happened was ki the witness told that I am the eyewitness to this incident because I was passing the way, and when I stopped to the particular location, I saw this murder being committed. But what happened was later on, due to my intuitiveness about this, and I particularly went to that place in Delhi. I looked how one can be there and see witness incident being occurred. What I saw was where he said he himself to be placed at the time of the incident. He said that he was at a petrol station when this crime was being committed. But when I went to that petrol station, I saw that the place is being obstructed by a building. I very well took the snapshots of the same and brought before the court. The court also took the notice of the fact and appreciated that it's important, although, because if the witness is the prime eyewitness to your incident, then it is important that he must prove the occurrence of the incident beyond reasonable doubt. But if there is obstruction, then there is some ambiguity in his statements. Then next is to attack his reliability. How reliable he is. Now, mostly this reliabilities can be easily be attacked by the independent evidences, by some other evidences, by adducing some other evidences. His reliability can be attacked, and at that time, your witness comes into your zone because he knows that if he answers the question, or if he answers this, or if he proceeds further with this case, that it might harm his credibility before the court and before the people itself. Now, the interesting thing about the cross examination is this, that it's not only about the points which have covered in the examination in chief, or it is not basically about it's not only about the relevance of the case, because as section 146 of the Evidence Act clearly gives some additions where where one can cross examine, which are to see the veracity of the witness, and to shake the credibility of the witness, and
So would you like to have a 2-minute break?
no, I'm fine. I just to see the veracity, or to check the veracity of the witness, and to see the reliability, and to
Yeah.
check the credibility of the witness. So it is important that when hello am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So it's important that all these things should be kept in mind, because this is the most important part, because the cross examination is the uh, point where your case will be decided, where you will bring all the evidences before the court and substantiate that these cases are very insightful for the present case. Now coming to the cross examination not provided by the statute. So what if the cross examination, like I told you earlier about the hostile witnesses, the cross examination by the prosecution himself, or the witness that he has already only produced, he cannot cross examine him. But if in any case, if that person turns hostile, if the witness turns hostile, the cross examiner is allowed to the prosecution is allowed to cross examine his own witness. So that is the only witness which is not witness which is not provided by the statute, but is only given by the consent of the case, where if the witness has turned hostile, it's important for the prosecution to establish his case, to uh, to tarnish his credibility, or to decline his credibility of this credibility of the witness himself. The other point is the court witness. So court witness is a witness who judge on his own initiative causes to produce in court, and whose primary examination is done by the court himself. What happens in the court witness is, when the court believes that he needs to have this witness produced, and it's important that this witness be brought and record, primarily the court only asks the question, cross-examines the witness, and only after that, both the prosecution and the cross-examiner are allowed to cross-examine that witness by the consent of the court. And in some cases, the court might also deny if it doesn't deem fit that the person be cross-examined. Now, coming on to the 1 minute. permissible limits of cross-examination. So, what are the limits where you can cross-examine? It's important that you stick to the relevancy of the case, but it's equally important that you establish your case. What happens sometimes is mostly in the mostly in the arbitration cases, what happens is because the cross examination is only between the 2 or 3 or 4 between the 4 people sitting on a table. So whenever the cross examiner asks any irrelevant question or which does not tend to support our case, and he has a plan for it, the arbitrator tends to interfere a lot, which you might not, there are chances that you might face that in criminal trial as well, because in the criminal trial, judges are very well aware, very well versed with the fact that the lawyer must be building his case. But sometimes what happens is sometimes the examiner goes well ahead and tend to say some scandalous or some scandalous material, where the court has to interfere. So it's important that the cross-examiner sticks to relevancy of the case and only go beyond the relevancy of the case where he wants to establish something without getting scandalous about any of the issue or against the witness. The next point to be covered is the role of the complainant in a before that, I also need to cover one more topic, which is section 313. What section 313 says is under this provision, the court tends to ask the accused what all question he asks, what all stand he has regarding the evidence. So in 313, what happens is court at any stage of the trial, and mostly after the evidence, prosecution evidence, mostly after the prosecution evidence, tend to ask the accused. And let me tell you, this is the first time that accused comes before the court, and this is a conversation between a judge and the accused. After a tedious process of bail, register of FIR, and register of complaint, framing of charges, charge sheet, and after all of this, this is the first time that an accused is asked to answer all these questions where the evidences has lied the case. Although the accused cannot be compelled to answer it, it's his choice whether he wants to answer, he wants to remain silent about it. Court cannot take any action about it. But in support of his case, he can produce some statements or can talk to judge about what all stand he has about the case regarding as established by the prosecution. So that is the only part where the 313 plays. So now coming on to the next point, that is role of complainant in a complaint. So let me tell you about this. The complainant has no role in it. Whenever a crime is committed and whenever a complaint is made, basically the crime is always committed against the state. And once the complaint is filed and once the trial begins, it's only the prosecutor which handles the crime against state. Even in some cases which are non-compoundable, one cannot even settle the case if one wants to, because it's a crime against state. And in a crime against state, even if you want to withdraw the case and if you want to withdraw your complaint, one cannot do until unless the case has been tried or once the person is discharged or acquitted. Also, coming on to the next point, which is arguments. In arguments, there's no major thing to tell you anything about it. Everyone has their own strategy or own game plan about it, to how to deal with that. But let me tell you one thing which I have faced and I want you all to know. That is, never get intimidated by the other counsel or the public prosecutor or be it any other advocate. There was a case where the bar council chairman was against me in a tribunal. And let me tell you that was the initial time. That at that time I just started with my practice, and I was very intimidated by the fact, and I was told by a lot of person that you are going against the chairman of Bar Council of India, and he's going to represent the matter. But rather than getting intimidated at that time, what one tends to do is keep present your case. Just focus on what all facts do you have, what all evidences you have produced, and never miss any of the evidence or the fact that has already been brought on record to either disapprove it or to prove it. Cover everything, because that might later harm your case, because after one goes to appeal and then further before Supreme Court or High Court, it's very difficult to adduce that one wasn't able to bring that particular uh, particular evidence or particular examination on record. So during the argument, it's the most important part is to have a composure about whether, even if you believe that you are losing the case, have a great composure in your mind that you have to give your 100% at that time. And after that, what comes is the judgment. So judgment basically covers judgment is basically after going through all the evidences, all the statement given by the accused, the defense witnesses. Only after that, the judgment part comes in. And what happens in this is the judge has to deliver the judgment, the magistrate or the session court. And the procedure for that is has to be given in the language of the court, and the other part is that even either it can be dictated, either it can be written, or it has to be done in the open court. So that is all. That is all to sum up the criminal trial. Before proceeding forward with the post-criminal trial, I would also like to tell you one more thing. During the cross-examination, which I missed, during the cross-examination, it's very important, and even in the examination in chief, it's very important that you know your witness, you know everything about your witness. And as quoted by a very prominent, I'll say, sitcom advocate Harvey Specter, don't play the odds, play the man. So it very well resonates with the criminal trial as well, that it's important that you play the man and in order to establish your case. Proceeding forward with the appeal and the revision. What happens is, once the judgment comes in, so the judgment can either be acquittal or the conviction. What happens is if in either of the cases, if there is a conviction, then if the conviction is done by the magistrate, then the appeal lies before the session court. And if it is done by the session court, the appeal lies before the High Court. And similarly, the High Court appeal lies before the Supreme Court. And the difference between appeal and revision is the appeal is a right and revision is not a right. So by that, I mean, although one can ask for appeal and go to appeal regarding the facts which have not been considered, regarding flaw in the process, in the procedure, one can go about any issue. But in the revision, it's mostly the suo motu taken by the court to see whether the relevant question, whether the relevant law has been dealt with, whether the question of law has been dealt with, whether the proper procedure has been followed. Also, one more point before that is the reference. So in reference, what is reference is, sometimes the magistrate, while dealing with the point, or the session court while dealing with the point or the question of law which has not been decided yet, tends to refer the matter before the High Court and to ask a decision on that particular question, which the session court or the magistrate doesn't have jurisdiction to go into. So basically, all this sums up the criminal trial. Uh, all this sums up the criminal trial. If now I can go ahead with the questions.
So we'll be having the question and answer round now. And people are allowed to unmute themselves and ask the questions from Mr. Lalit and Mr. Bhatia. Lalit,
Yeah,
sir, are you
hello.
there? Just a second, please wait. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. So shall we continue with the session, sir?
Yes, please.
Mr. Bhatia?
Yeah.
Yeah. So please raise your hand right in the chat box if you want to have the questions, and we'll allow you one by one. Yeah. Please
Yes,
write
sir.
in chat box first. Yeah, please continue. Komali Pasanja, please. Komali, you can ask your questions. Anyone else want to ask the question?
Yeah, sorry, sir. Hello.
Hello, I have a question regarding
Please
plea
one by
bargaining.
one. Please one by one.
One by
Yeah. I'm saying please write your name in the chat box and then we'll allow you to ask the question. Komali, please continue.
Yeah, hello,
Yes,
sir.
somebody.
Yes, sir. Can you brief me about custodial interrogation, sir?
To whom you have my address? Karthik, you want to take it or should I take it?
You take it.
Okay. So, custodial death or custodial interrogation?
Yeah, custodial interrogation, sir.
Okay. So basically, a very limited part is there with the police that during the custody, first of all we need to see what authorities does the police have during the custody, whether they actually have the power to harass the accused person or to go ahead with first degree, second degree, third degree. First, we need to see that thing. Second, only with respect to the commission of offense which the police can ask. And one important thing which we need to consider that while giving statement or while receiving statement by the police in the custodial interrogation, the statement is prima facie does not have any value. However, during the stage of evidence and cross-examination, if it is corroborated with any other particular examination of witness or with any other evidence, then it does have. Moreover, last, there is one important thing that it is perhaps required by the witness to sign the statement also. It's mentioned in CRPC. So sometimes police ask for the signature. So if these one or couple of things, if we may pick, then we can actually show that whether this testimony is derived through pressure or not. So I think prima facie I gave whatever you have asked for. Is there anything else on this?
Yes, sir. What if the suspect is not under arrest?
Not under arrest.
Yeah.
As I told you in the first session, there are a couple of sections, section 91 and section 92 of CRPC. Section 91 gives the power of the police to ask the person to come up and give his evidence or to give his statement. Whereas section 92 says that the person can submit his documents later without causing his personal presence. So these are people. The police has requisite authority even when the accused person is not under arrest.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you.
Dr. Partha, please don't share screen and proceed with your question.
Yeah, Mr. Parth, please. We are waiting for you.
Anyone else want to ask any question? Can discharge of applications can be challenged?
Of course, it can. Of course, and it must be challenged. And on this aspect, I have seen one question when Mr. Sarthak Bhatia was perusing. One question was asked when what to do when when the FIR is quashed by the High Court. So you have no other option but to file an appeal against that quashing of FIR decision.
Mr. Swarnim Burnham, please continue with your question.
Yeah. Okay. So my question is to Lalit sir. Actually, I only asked that question, that what's the option left for the other party if the FIR is quashed. So, sir, for that, will you
See,
please elaborate a bit?
See, in quashing of FIR, what generally, if the FIR is quashed, High Court will tell you the reason why the FIR is quashed. Now, it's very difficult for the High Court to quash the FIR, and it will say that there is no prima facie case. So, what you are left with, you have very easy job. In fact, I would say in appeal, you would just state out this thing that prima facie there is a case, and the court does not have any authority to go into the peculiarities of the facts, because to be very honest, if the High Court has quashed the FIR, it has actually traveled beyond its power. It's very rare that you can cementize that yes, without without going into the peculiarities of the fact, High Court can quash the FIR. It's very difficult. So while filing appeal, you just need to say that whatever the High Court has decided, it's a matter of fact and cannot be decided without appreciating the evidence. And furthermore, you need to see whether the charges are framed or not. For example, if the charges are not framed, then you will say that if you are if you are filing, you can just say that in this matter the charges are not even framed. How can court presume and go ahead with this? And in other cases, if suppose charges are framed, then you take the defense, and then you can take it that your lordship, that the trial court is of prima facie opinion that there is a case which goes against the accused person, and appreciation of evidence is nothing but a requirement and the need of the hour, and therefore the High Court should not quash the petition. So I guess it's not very difficult job to challenge the quashing of FIR.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Mr. Zulfikar Hussain.
How many appeals can be filed in trial court and High Court at different levels? I think we need elaboration. Mr. Hussain, if Mr. Ratan, you could unmute Mr. Hussain. What did he actually mean?
I can't unmute. I can just mute the person.
Okay. Mr. Hussain, if you want to clarify, because it's not very clear what you meant through this question. Okay, you may join us later. We proceed with the other questions. Mr. Hussain, please ask.
Mr. Ramaprashant S.
Yeah, in which states the charge can be discharged. As I told you that it's just after taking the cognizance of a case, the magistrate gives the option to the counsel of the accused person to either submit the application for discharge, or without submitting the application, the accused counsel can present his case and ask for discharge. So it is probably the second hearing, the second effective hearing in the court of criminal criminal cases, where the framing of charges and discharge of frame is possible. And just to clarify this thing, if your case is of someone's case which is being tried by the magistrate, you have no authority, you have no right for seeking discharge. You can just file the quashing of FIR, or you need to face the trial.
Next question is from Muhammad Azaruddin.
Yeah, my question
Yeah.
is, what if the police officer refuses to take the complaint?
What if the police officer refused to take the complaint?
Yeah.
So see, it quite happens that police officials don't take the complaint, and you just need to first send the written complaint to the police official. they may return, they may not return. You actually have the the hard copy, and you send it the same to the DCP. If you are
Okay.
living in a metropolitan city, or if you are not living in the metro city, then is the superintendent of police. Then you can smartly do it. You can send it through post. Now, while sending through the post, you have the evidence that you have advised the police officials regarding this. Police won't take the action. Now, just after 1 week, you go and file section 156 with section 200 before concerned magistrate, asking for directions to be given to the concerned police officers to register your complaint and proceed with the registration of FIR.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
So we are running out of time.
Last question, Mr. Satak, if you want to take, and then I think I just need to add a couple of things which I forget. Ms. Safa Fatima has asked.
Can you lighten us related custodial death? What option is left for the victim family? So, 1 minute. So, in custodial death, although there's no particular statute has been set regarding the custodial death, or no particular law has been made regarding that, but although even if the custodial death takes place, what one needs to do is, one can do is that the complaint gets registered in the same police station by the officer other than who has committed or who has been accomplice in the crime, and similarly, like other criminal trial, the action is taken against them. Also, it is seen whether the custodial death is for some other reason or not. So that point is equally important.
Lalit sir, please wind up the session.
Yes, just couple of things. One has asked about remand. Remand is basically may take some time. Basically, remand is something when the case is committed to the lower court. For example, if some application or something is pending before the session court, and the case requires the guidance of a magistrate court, or the magistrate is required to take the case, then the court may remand back the case to the magistrate court. That's just one part of the remand. However, considering the paucity of time, I just want to state a couple of things. Those are really important. First, people and in fact clients are also always under the pretext whether they can go ahead with the civil case also or not. Because in the beginning, if we remember that we need to understand whether a particular alleged offense is of criminal in nature and civil in nature. But in practicality, every offense has two phases. First is civil and second is criminal. And if your client wants not only justice but also the compensation, so you may initiate both the things at the same point of time, so that you should not run away from the litigation. And it is no malafide, or it is no, I would say, pressure tactics that you are initiating against the other person. So you could go ahead simultaneously. That's one thing that I think that's very common. And second, which I perhaps missed, is that you should be well aware about the vernacular language of your state. For example, in the beginning, when I confronted with my first charge sheet or second charge sheet case, it was written in entirely entirely Urdu, sorry. And it's not just Urdu, it's probably legal Urdu or legal Hindi. And right from the beginning, we have been studying everything regarding in English or in official language. But if you see the criminal case, especially the charge sheet, maybe your complaint, maybe your one or couple of statements are in or in the language which suit you. But mostly what police do, police write everything in the vernacular language. So in northern India, apart from Punjab, everything is being done in Hindi. So that's and in south in middle India also, I think everything is being done in Hindi, apart from Gujarat and Maharashtra, whereas South India has certain various languages. So you must be well versed with this thing. and probably that's one of the reasons why this flat issue is also turning up. But I think it's better if we can come up with one semester regarding the vernacular legal language, because that's very important. And lastly, in non-metropolitan states, everything is being conducted in the vernacular language. For example, I have recently confronted with some case going on in Patiala court. Matrimonial dispute was there. So the cross-examination was written in Punjabi language. And so it's very difficult for the other person to get acquainted with that, because though you may get the translation, that's not the point. But it's always better if you actually know the concerned vernacular language. So if you are heading towards criminal litigation, you may make sure that you start brushing up with the vernacular language, and it's of course not difficult, but initial cases may trick you, because it's very difficult to understand those Urdu words if you belong to northern part of India, or probably in the topmost part of the country. I think with this we can wrap it up if there is no other question. What do you say, Mr. Ratan?
Yeah, hello, sir.
Hello.
Yeah, sir. Who has the discrimination power, sir?
Discrimination power in the sense?
No, whether central government or state government.
Regarding what?
Regarding discriminating the things like if central government says some lockdown measures, then some state is following and other state is not following.
It depends upon the concerned High Court. High Court, in consultation with the governor of that state, decides the official language of the state, and the amendment can also be come up. If you see the CRPC, you will see hundreds of amendments pertaining to the concerned states. So it is the prerogative of the state to come up with these little amendments. Of course, when the issue is of national importance, it is the state which can overrule, or which will, of course, deal with this. But as far as I've just given you, this is just one of the example regarding the language, official language of the court is concerned. It is the concerned High Court. The best example could be Haryana. Recently, Haryana has come up that everything needs to be done in Hindi. So, so it's perfectly legal, and since it's in the hand of the concerned High Court along with the concurrent of the governor, so yes, states can mold whatever they want to mold.
It depends on high court, sir.
Yes, it depends upon the High Court, and every trial court is being run on the guidelines and on as well as on the rules and regulations prescribed by the High Court. So, for example, if you go to Delhi High Court website, you will see that there are High Court filing regulations, there are original side regulations, there are appellate regulations, there are regulations with respect to evidence and proper filing also. So filing, the basic aspect, filing is different in every court. So it's all depends upon the High Court.
Now, a last question, then we'll wind up the session. One cannot ask for bail in National Security Act. What remedy is left for the person who is booked under National Security Act?
Sarthak, will you? Hello?
Am I audible,
Yeah.
sir?
Yeah.
I
So
am
being
asking-
addressed to Sarthak or me?
So, if you want to, if you wish to answer, you
Okay.
can answer, Sarthak, sir.
Okay. I think we can both, because that's need various interpretations. So it's first of all very nice question, Ms. Safa Fatima. So it's first of all, it's not only the National Securities Act. There are certain other acts also. For example, recently Supreme Court has clarified that the offences against SC and ST, the anticipatory bail cannot be provided. So in such scenarios, you are basically left with the first quashing of FIR. That's the basic thing that you can go and ask for it. And second, if you cannot go secure the bail, what you can seemingly ask probably for the interim bail. Of course, the bail is not maintainable, but what in practical things, sometimes what you do, that once the law is against you, you try to find out the loopholes, or you try to find out various doors which can actually assist your client. During the investigation, of course, it's not possible, but after the investigation, if your client is coming up, that you may, for one reason or the other, if your client, for example, has some health issues or certain issues with respect, which requires his personal presence in his home, then you can ask for it. There is a concept of parole also. So these little things that you could come up and you could try. So prima facie, of course, you don't have anything but to adhere with this. But as I said, that once you go into the details, you will find one or couple of those which may assist your client. And even, for example, if a person is going through, is suffering the imprisonment, so and if he gets a relief for one month or couple of months or 3 months, that's huge for him. So of course you will not get everything, but something is always there. You may need to read the act, and of course if not only just NSA, whenever these NSA comes into picture, various other acts are also attracted. So you could try to strike on those things also. So it happens that when law does not favor you, so you try to find the little doors what the law always opens for you. Now I think there, as I said, that there are various interpretations. I asked Mr. Bhatia to address this interesting question, and then of course we can end up. And I request Mr. Ratan, if you come up with any of the questions from the audience, they may write to you, or you can send them questions to us, and we would be more than happy to address the same.
Sure, so definitely we'll let you know if we have any questions from the audience.
Mr. Sarthak, so what do you want to say about this so that we can wrap it up?
1 minute. So my basic conclusion about this is that whenever one starts with a criminal trial, or one after passing out from your colleges, or who was already practicing, so it's a great way to, it's a great process to start the criminal trial, but it also needs a lot of hard work, and one needs to have that patience and that composure, so can succeed in this field. Anything else, Atul?
No, sir. So now we'll end the session. Thank you so much, Lalit sir and Mr. Sarthak Bhatia, for this wonderful session and telling us what are the basic meaning of criminal codes and how criminal codes function.
Pleasure is ours.
So
Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting us,
everyone. And also we have one more session with Lalit sir on 11th of July. So please let us know if you wish to attend that session as well. Now we can end the session. Devshri, recording. Please stop the recording.
Thank you, Mr. Ratan, and thank you so much for this
Thank you all
wonderful interactive audience.